Hey guys, welcome back to Fishing College. This is Ramey Outdoors, and today we're going to be diving into why or why not you should be using monofilament. I think it's a line that gets a completely bad rap, especially in the common day fishing world, but let's go ahead and dive into the pros and cons of this actual line. Remember to go ahead and like and subscribe, and let's get right into it. So let's go ahead and start getting in with the pros of monofilament. The first thing that we're really going to start talking about is price. In terms of actual cost, monofilament is going to come in at your absolute cheapest line. And I'm not talking about, a couple of cents. I'm talking about several dollars or even tens of $20 in terms of actual cost for spool. I'm sure that you can come in and get a spool of about 500 yards of monofilament for less than $10 at some places. I'm actually not sure what the going rate for monofilament is right now, so could be wrong on that, but it is a very cheap line. Now that does come with some drawbacks because it is so cheap, but because it is a single strand nylon created line, it is going to be way easier to create than braid or fluorocarbon. Let's go into for number 2. It is incredible for beginners. If you're going to be spooling up with any line and you are brand new to fishing, go with monofilament. I know that sounds like, really, against the grain compared to what a lot of these other anglers are recommending when they're recommending braid or fluorocarbon, but monofilament, because it is so cheap and because of some other qualities that we'll get into later, it is really great for beginner anglers because it is going to teach you what you can and can't do because of the way it is. And we're going to get into that later. We're going to get into kind of 3, 4, and 5 here. A little bit of a rapid fire. Because of its overall shock resistance and because it is so stretchy, it is actually the most stretchy line. It is amazing for any kind of treble hooks. And that is something that a lot of beginners and even some intermediate anglers struggle with, is treble hooks. They will try and apply way too much pressure and they will end up ripping the hooks out of the fish's mouth. Treble hooks are something that if you apply too much pressure, they're going to basically be counterintuitive. There's no reason to have that hand of God hook set. There's no reason to use insane amounts of pressure because you are just going to rip it out of the mouth of the fish. So that's kind of like that 3, 4, 5 type, just rapid fire. Because it's so stretchy, because it has really good shock resistance, it is going to be really great for any kind of treble hooks. That's why I primarily run monofilament whenever I'm running crankbaits or whenever I am running any kind of jerkbaits or sometimes big swim baits, but that's another video. So in terms of abrasion resistance, monofilament kind of runs into that like middle section. It's not great at it, but it's not bad at it by any means. You can definitely throw it down in there into some rocks, you can throw it around there into some cover, and it's not going to give you any kind of crazy trouble. Moving on to number 7, it is pretty okay at tying knots. You have some people who are like, fluorocarbon is awful at tying knots, braid is really good at tying knots. Monofilament is okay. Because it is a thicker diameter line, you can sometimes run some difficulty into actually tying some knots, but overall, it's going to be pretty good for those beginner type knots. Last but not least, let's talk about one of the big things with monofilament is that it comes in a wide variety of colors. So if you're having trouble with seeing your fishing line, that could be something that you want to check into, is the wide variety of color that monofilament offers. Now, braid also offers this. I haven't seen multicolored fluorocarbon, but I could be wrong. But for the fact that it comes in so many different colors, that can be a pretty big pro for any kind of beginner angler. For example, I'm running like just white clearish monofilament here, but I could easily get green, I could easily get red, stuff like that. Now let's kind of talk about that kind of middle tier, which is that it's not really a pro, it's not really a con. And that is the fact that monofilament is by far the stretchiest. And I did mention this earlier in the fact that it is kind of a pro in some instances, but it can also be kind of a pro-con type deal depending on where you are using it. So for example, if you're using a really thick gauge hook, like let's say on a topwater frog, you definitely would not want to use monofilament because it is just going to stretch and stretch and stretch. And that's going to cause a lot of issues for you. Another thing is that it also floats. Monofilament is one of the two lines that do float. So that is monofilament and braid. So if you're using any kind of bottom contact lure, this is going to have an upward pulling effect on your lure. So now let's get into some of these cons, and this is kind of where people really start to knock on monofilament, is because it does come with a lot of cons. The first one being UV deterioration. And some of you, like your bank anglers, who aren't going to just have your rod and reel out to the sun a whole bunch, this may not affect you very much. But those boat anglers that always have a bunch of rods laying around, just soaking up UV, this is going to make a huge difference because it starts to degrade your fishing line very easily. It can make it stretch more, it can cause nicks to become a lot larger, things like that, and that can create a huge problem, especially for tournament anglers and boat fishermen. Really massive con that people talk about quite often with monofilament is the fact that it contains a lot of memory. So notice how whenever I pull this out, it's not exactly straight, it's wanting to coil. That is part of what monofilament does, is that it tends to coil and it tends to memorize the line and the actual shape of the spool. So that's why whenever I'm pulling this out, it is wanting to remember that it has been on a spool and it is wanting to take on the characteristics of that. So what can that do? A lot of the time what memory is going to do is that it's just going to create little coils. And if it's not very bad memory, it may not do a whole lot. But what it can do is that it can lead to more bird's nesting or wind knots if you're using a bait caster or a spinning rod. So that can sometimes be a little bit of an issue, especially if you are not using that line very often and it is just sitting and sitting and sitting and sitting on that spool. Another really big thing is that it's not very good for long distance hook sets. Remember how I said that it has a ton of stretch? That is a very good example. That stretch is going to basically be a big problem the longer your line is out. So say that I'm trying to hook set something that is only 10 yards from the boat. That may not be as big of a problem, but say that I'm trying to hook set something that's about 50, 60, 70 yards from the boat. I am gonna have to pull an incredibly far distance back, or I might have to reel in a bunch of line before I give that hook set to actually get a good hook set. Otherwise, it's just going to deem a really big problem and I might miss that fish. Another really big thing with monofilament, and this is kind of two things in one, is that it is classified as the weakest type of line. And that's mostly just because it cuts so easily. It has a very big tendency to basically snap whenever it is around any kind of really sharp objects. So if you're going in and around those rocks and you find one that's particularly sharp, it might just flat out cut on you. Or if you're fishing around with some fish that have some teeth, like walleye or pike or things like that, they might be able to cut straight through your line very easily. The last thing to talk about with monofilament is that it is very, very thick, but it is also low sensitivity. So in terms of like your sensitivity hierarchy, you have monofilament down at the bottom, you have fluorocarbon kind of in that middle tier, and then you have braid, which is by far and away the most sensitive. And I'm going to be making separate videos on those fishing lines relatively soon. But in the fact that it is very not sensitive, it's not very good for those relatively subtle or basic bites that some fish might be having. Particularly if a fish is trying to soft bite or short bite, and that is where they might be just nipping at the back of your bait, it may not be very good for you. When do I use monofilament? I primarily use monofilament for crankbaits, jerkbaits, and also whenever I'm fishing really large swim baits. But sometimes I still will use fluorocarbon with those jerkbaits and crankbaits. It just kind of depends on what depth I'm actually fishing at. For example, if I'm going to be fishing really deep in really clear water, I'm going to more go for fluorocarbon. However, if I'm fishing a little bit more like middle or upper in the water column, I'm probably going to be choosing monofilament over that. Just because that overall depth and the fact that it floats doesn't really matter as much to me. Whereas if I'm fishing really deep, the fact that fluorocarbon doesn't float is going to matter to me. So it does have a variety of actual applications. However, sometimes there might be better options for you. But give monofilament a try. It's not a bad fishing line by any standards. However, there are definitely better fishing lines out there. So I hope this helps, and this is going to be one of the first few videos in the Fishing College series on my YouTube channel. So if you guys want me to make more videos like this, please let me know down in the comments and what you want to see next. But I hope this helps, and as per usual, have fun catching fish, people. Peace.